a great example of that particular case, but there was definitely many people who saw sort of synergy, right, between learning science, learning about science, and their own faith. So
we have a book on. So I have another book that I wrote a few years ago called "Science versus Religion: What Scientists Really Think." Science versus religion, what scientists really think. This one's religion versus science, what religious people really think, right? So you get this sort of idea.
I hope that's helpful. And in that first book, I did talk a lot about, what it would mean to be a person of faith and be a scientist. And our team, through the Religion Public Life program, is now doing an 8-country study of scientists' attitudes towards religion and pulling out, different groups of scientists. And there definitely is a segment who see, it's less common, but there definitely is a segment who see their faith is actually motivating, enhancing their scientific work, and in particular the application of their work. That's where it comes out a lot more. Deciding, say, not to take money from a certain funder because of faith reasons, or deciding that they're not going to be involved in a certain type of research, or they're going to make special effort to communicate science to a certain group of people because of their faith and motivating them. So it does come up.
I applaud the idea of collaboration between science and religion or religious groups, but I think there's also a need for collaboration between religious groups. But I do have a question. I wonder how the panel feels about, do you think that collaboration should extend to classroom curriculum in public schools?
I thought our conversation wasn't getting controversial enough, so we should just, so if anyone else has something like that you want to put out there, just be thinking of it.
Where does the collaboration end?
Right, where does the collaboration end? Right. So that's more of a thought question than something that our data speak to directly. It's more of a matter of our personal opinion, but I think scholars sometimes shy from putting our personal opinions out there, so I'll go ahead. I do think that we need to have more education of primary and secondary teachers about the kinds of things that they say around science education. So for certain communities, shutting down any God talk in the classroom can really keep them away from science. And so, what do you say when a kid brings up something about their faith in the context of a scientific discussion? And so it's not that we think necessarily that religion should be taught alongside science in the same class, that there seems to be, a legal structure that would prevent us from doing that in the public schools. But there's something else that's happening, which is that teachers aren't really trained how to address adequately concerns kids might have about science, right? That this seems to be a piece of science communication curriculum or science education curriculum. It would seem to fit well there with all kinds of things that are related to science. This perhaps could be another kind of issue that's related to the cultural acceptance of science that could fit in that kind of way of training things. This should be a longer conversation than we have time for here, but I think it's a really important question.
Hi, I'm sorry. I'm from India. I'm a Christian. But I do want to pose a question as a Hindu person. Have you guys studied Hinduism in your survey at all? Because their religion is very much embedded or mixed with science. Do you see people turning into that faith because of this reason? Because they seem to be more logical in their explanation of faith compared to the Bible, where there are lesser science facts produced in the Bible.
So in the book, we obviously had no interviews with Hindu congregations or Hindu individuals, and the survey probably had, I don't know, 10 maybe Hindu respondents, I don't know, just because that's what you would expect based off of a random sample. So the short answer to did we do much specifically with Hinduism or Hindu individuals would be no. I know there's a professor who I worked with as an undergrad, Mackenzie Brown, who's really interested. He's a religious studies professor, and he's really interested in religion science issues. And before he did religion science stuff, he was sort of an expert in Hinduism. And so I guess all I can tell you is to look. I think he wrote a book on religion, science, and Hinduism.
Yes, he did, yeah.
So Mackenzie Brown, that would be the person to look for.
I think you raise a larger issue about how much of the conflict between religion and science is really perhaps a conflict between Christianity and science, and if there are different religious traditions or different cultural contexts. And I would add to that, is it a conflict between a particular form of Christianity and science? I mean, we know that there was a robust strain in history of Christians feeling motivated to pursue science because of their Christian calling and conviction. So there's a lot of cultural issues in what you say, which I think are really important. I did, for a separate project, interview scientists and interviewed a Hindu scientist who said, when I asked him, is there a conflict, do you think there's a conflict between religion and science? He's like, well, I'll answer that question, but as a Hindu, it seems like a stupid question to me. So you have to love interviewing very educated people who feel perfectly free to contradict the researcher and say, you're asking dumb questions. So I think you're right. I think there are differences among traditions and how they see these things. They're really important differences that we have to pay attention to. How much more do we have time for?
I just was wondering if in your objective questioning that any identity with science and space and the vast program we have to move ourselves beyond the Earth and always the possibility of finding life somewhere else. Was there any comments made or identity made with science and that objective, which seems to have a lot of support among the American people?
Wow, that's a great question.
I don't think I've ever done a survey where a month after doing the survey or getting the data, I think, oh, we should have asked that question. And I think that was the case. There were several issues that we didn't ask about that if we could, some time machine or whatever, we could go back and do. And so on the survey, we didn't ask, I'm pretty sure we didn't ask anything about space exploration or anything like that.
We didn't.
Yeah, we kicked ourselves about that because that's such an important issue. I have been part of a roundtable discussion on exoplanets and faith once, which was really fascinating since I'm not sure I really know what exoplanets are, but there were people there who did, so that was the important thing. And there obviously the idea of life on other planets. Can we ourselves go to other planets and live? What does this mean from a Christian understanding? Did Christ come also for those people on other planets? Those are the kind of conversations we were having in this discussion. So I think all that to say, you're raising incredibly important issues that someone ought to study, but we haven't, unfortunately.
My question is over the survey that you carried out and the interviews that you carried out. Was the data show if the leadership of the different religions, did they line up with the responses that you received from individuals, or they differ?
So our survey was a sort of random sample of U.S. adults, and so we didn't specifically sample or survey any religious leaders or congregational leaders, other than maybe interviews that were done. So we don't really have a way to compare statistically sort of the percent of Catholic priests who think something versus the percent of Catholic lay people.
That's a good question. The only thing we can do is address that through these 23 organizational studies we did, where we interviewed leaders of the organizations, the religious organizations, and then also interviewed congregants. And sometimes there was definitely a difference in what leaders thought and congregants thought. As Chris said, we can't statistically verify that, But I do think that that's important to think through based on our interviews, because we're already seeing just in these interview data that there's the possibility of real difference. So leaders might think they know what their congregants think, and yet not really know.
Hi, my name is Miles Lewis. I identify as a mainline Protestant. Before I start, I just want to say thank you very much for the book. I look forward to reading it, but based on what you can say, it seems like it's in an effort to bridge a gap, and something that I want to devote my time to bridging gaps and finding compromises and finding our partners and approaches. So now that through your books you've wrestled with the stereotypes of hostility between scientists and those of faith, what would you say to those who believe that Christianity specifically, when it comes to miracles and a younger earth, is antiquated and disproved by a more progressive approach to science?
What would I say to the person who advocates for miracles? Is that, or the person who says you should to the other?
Basically, you're wrong as a Christian because science is facts.
Well, I think the problem with this, the religion science conversations, as you might say, is that it often starts with the goal of conversion, one way or the other, right? Like, and as Elaine was saying earlier, there's a great deal of social science research that shows that you don't convert people through sort of intellectual debates. Right? Like, you're not going to be able to persuade someone to give up a huge part of their identity. And so I guess I would say that that conversation from the very beginning is flawed and going to fail. The other thing I would say is that, the other thing I would say is, I think there's a lot of room for people to have kind of personal interpretations of the world and go about their lives and still engage with science and be successful at science. I think we often have this assumption that if you think this, you must do this, or you can't do this, or, like it's kind of, you have to fit into a box, right? Well, in reality, we all do things that seem contradictory to someone else, right? And so I think it's probably fairly possible to think that there are miracles and still engage in science and be part of science. That may seem contradictory to someone else, but I'm sure that person does things that seem contradictory to you, right? So
here's where having done some interviews with scientists who are persons of faith is interesting. And we have, both for this project and others, done interviews with, say, evangelical Christians who are scientists who also believe in miracles, and actually mainline Protestants who are scientists who believe in miracles. But they think that their science is a particular way of knowing, that science doesn't describe, science is not totalizing in that it describes everything that's worth knowing, but that it describes very well the things that science can do well. It's a particular kind of tool for a particular aspect of the world, and there are other parts of the world that have to do with things of faith or beauty, or that are things which religion speaks more heavily to. Some of those scientists think that their science is sort of contained within the religion. Some of those scientists think that their religion is in one box and their science is in one box. So they have different frameworks of understanding how their faith speaks to their science and their science speaks to their faith. So that's probably the best we can do as social scientists, right? We can tell you the range of ways that people understand these things as being compatible with one another, and I can tell you statistically that there is a group of scientists who think these things are completely compatible. We probably need to cut it off, which I hate, because you write an academic book, and usually people don't actually read them. And then you ask yourself, well, then why would you write them? but you usually make your students read them. But we feel like you coming here tonight is some sign that you might actually engage with the ideas in this book. And we wanted to write this book so that it would be the kind of text that people could engage with. And so we're really, really grateful that you made time for this. If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, we are selling some out there. We'd also just love for you to hang around and not only talk with us, but talk with each other. And we have some snacks to try to incentivize you to do that. So we hope you'll stay for that. Thank you so much.